Some of the biggest lies in history weren't accidents. They were designed, crafted by people who needed you to believe something that wasn't true. And the disturbing part isn't that they lied. It's that it worked. These lies became facts. They were taught in schools, printed in textbooks, repeated so many times that questioning them felt ridiculous. And centuries later, we're still teaching them, still believing them, still building our understanding of history on foundations that are completely false. If you're tired of the sanitized version of history, subscribe to A Disturbed Historian. We're digging into the stories they got wrong on purpose. Let's start with Napoleon. You've heard he was short, right? Napoleon complex. Little man syndrome. The angry short guy who conquered Europe to compensate for his height. It's in comedy routines, political cartoons, common knowledge, except it's completely false. Napoleon wasn't short. He was average height for his time, around 5'6" or 7" in modern measurements. The average Frenchman was about 5'5". Napoleon was actually slightly taller than most of his countrymen. So where did the lie come from? British propaganda. England was at war with France for over a decade. Napoleon was beating them, badly. The British needed to undermine him, make him seem ridiculous, less threatening. So British cartoonists started drawing him as a tiny, angry man throwing tantrums. James Gilray, the most famous political cartoonist of the era, depicted Napoleon as a miniature figure. The cartoons were everywhere. They were funny. They were memorable, and they worked. The confusion was also partly measurement. The French inch was longer than the British inch. When Napoleon's height was recorded at his death as 5'2" in French measurements, British sources didn't convert it properly. They reported it as 5'2" in English measurements, which made him genuinely short. The error spread. Nobody bothered to correct it, because the lie was more useful than the truth. And now, 200 years later, people still believe Napoleon was short. The propaganda outlived the man, outlived the British Empire that created it. That's how good lies work. They don't need to be maintained. They maintain themselves. Vikings are another perfect example. Ask anyone what Vikings were like. Dirty, barbaric, savage raiders who burned everything and bathed never, wore horned helmets, drank from skulls, uncivilized brutes from frozen wastelands. Every single piece of that image is wrong. Vikings bathed regularly, more regularly than medieval Christians, actually. Archaeologists have found combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, and soap at Viking sites. They have written accounts from the time. An Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan met Vikings in the 10th century and wrote about them washing their faces and combing their hair every morning. He was actually somewhat disgusted because they shared the same bowl of water. But the point stands. They cared about hygiene. They also didn't wear horned helmets. Not once, not ever. That image comes from 19th century Romanticism. An artist designing costumes for a Wagner opera thought horned. Helmets looked cool and Viking-ish. The image stuck. It showed up in paintings, illustrations, eventually movies. Now everyone thinks Vikings wore horns, but actual Viking helmets, the few that survive, are simple rounded metal caps. Practical, effective, boring horns would be a liability in combat. They'd give your enemy something to grab. They'd catch on things. No Viking would wear them into battle. The savage barbarian image also came from their enemies. Vikings raided monasteries. Monasteries were full of monks. Monks wrote the histories. So of course the histories say Vikings were terrible. The people writing the accounts were the ones being raided. They had every reason to make Vikings sound as monstrous as possible, and they did. They described Vikings as inhuman, as God's punishment for sin, as forces of chaos and destruction. But Vikings were also traders, explorers, farmers. They had complex legal systems, art, poetry. They established trade routes from Scandinavia to the Middle East. They founded cities. Dublin was a Viking settlement, so was York. They integrated into societies. They conquered, intermarried, converted to Christianity. They were a culture, not just a raid. But the savage image serves a purpose. It makes European Christian civilization look better by contrast. It creates a narrative where Christianity civilized the barbaric North. That narrative was politically useful for centuries. So the lie persisted. And now when people think Viking, they think horned helmets and unwashed raiders, not merchants and poets, who happen to also be very good at violence. Medieval people supposedly being stupid is another lie that needs to die. The idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was a superstitious idiot who thought the earth was flat and that bathing was sinful. This image is everywhere: movies, TV, casual conversation. It's wrong on almost every level. Educated medieval people knew the earth was round. This wasn't controversial. Greek philosophers had figured it out over 1,000 years earlier, and that knowledge never disappeared. Medieval scholars read Aristotle. They read Ptolemy. They calculated the Earth's circumference. It was taught in universities. The myth that Columbus was trying to prove the Earth was round is modern invention. Nobody thought it was flat. The actual debate was about how big the Earth was and whether you could sail west to reach Asia without starving to death. Columbus thought the Earth was smaller than it actually was. He got lucky that America was in the way, or his crew would have died. Medieval people also bathed. They had public bathhouses, private baths for the wealthy, soap. They didn't bathe as frequently as we do now. But that's because heating water was labor-intensive and fuel was expensive, not because they thought water was evil. The idea that medieval Christians feared bathing comes from later. Protestant propaganda against Catholics and from Victorians projecting their own anxieties backward. Medieval people built cathedrals. Those structures required advanced mathematics, engineering, and organizational capacity. They required understanding of geometry, load-bearing, materials. The people designing and building cathedrals were not stupid. They were sophisticated engineers, working with the technology available to them. They also invented or refined things we still use. Mechanical clocks, eyeglasses, universities. The printing press came at the end of the medieval period, but it was built on medieval innovations. The scientific method has roots in medieval scholasticism. These people were thinking, innovating, building. So why the lie? Why do we imagine medieval people as idiots? Because it makes us feel superior. It supports a narrative of progress. We're smarter now, more advanced, more enlightened. And to believe that, we need the past to be worse. We need medieval people to be stupid so we can feel smart. It's comforting. It's also false. The term Dark Ages itself is propaganda. It was invented by Renaissance scholars who wanted to position themselves as the rebirth of classical learning after a long period of ignorance. They needed the period between Rome's fall and their own. Time to be dark so their own era could be the light. They exaggerated the collapse. They minimized medieval achievements. They created a narrative where nothing happened for 1,000 years. And then suddenly the Renaissance brought everything back. But the early medieval period wasn't dark. It was different. The Western Roman Empire collapsed, yes, But the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, continued for another 1,000 years. The Islamic Golden Age happened during the so-called Dark Ages. Scholars in Baghdad were doing advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine. They preserved Greek and Roman texts that would have been lost otherwise. They innovated, created. In Europe, monasteries kept learning alive. Monks copied texts. They studied. They experimented with agriculture, brewing, medicine. They weren't just praying. They were the intellectuals of their time. Kings and nobles couldn't read. Monks could. That's power. The medieval period also saw the development of common law, parliamentary systems, and the beginnings of representative government. These aren't the achievements of a dark age. These are the foundations of modern governance. But calling it the Dark Ages serves a purpose. It creates a break. It allows people to ignore continuity. It makes the Renaissance seem more revolutionary than it actually was. Renaissance scholars were building on medieval work, but they didn't want to admit that. So they invented a dark age to contrast themselves against. Cleopatra is another lie that's so embedded. People get angry when you correct it. Cleopatra was Egyptian, right? The last pharaoh of Egypt. Egyptian queen, except she wasn't Egyptian. She was Greek. Macedonian Greek, specifically. She was a descendant of Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals who took over Egypt after Alexander died. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for 300 years, and they stayed Greek. They spoke Greek, they practiced Greek customs. They married within the family to keep the bloodline pure, which led to all sorts of genetic problems, but they stayed Greek. Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler who bothered to learn Egyptian. That's how Greek they were. They ruled Egypt for 3 centuries and didn't learn the language until Cleopatra. She was brilliant, spoke multiple languages, politically savvy, but she wasn't ethnically Egyptian. The popular image of Cleopatra is often as an African or Middle Eastern woman, and that makes sense. Egypt is in Africa. Modern Egyptians are Middle Eastern, but the Ptolemies were foreign conquerors who never integrated. Cleopatra had more in common with Alexander the Great than with the Egyptian people she ruled. Why does this matter? Because it changes the story. Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony wasn't East meeting West, it was Greek meeting Roman, both Mediterranean powers, both heirs to Hellenistic culture. The exoticism attributed to Cleopatra is mostly projection. Roman sources described her as dangerously seductive, which was partly propaganda. Octavian, who would become Augustus, needed to paint her as a foreign threat to justify his war against Mark Antony. So he made her the exotic other, the Eastern temptress who corrupted good Roman men. That image stuck. It's more interesting than Greek princess uses political alliances to maintain power. So we remember Cleopatra as Egyptian when she was Greek, and as seductress when she was a skilled politician using the tools available to her. Here's another one that'll make people defensive. The idea that medieval Europe was white, homogeneous, pure. This is a modern invention, a lie that serves contemporary political purposes. Medieval Europe was diverse, not in the modern sense, but far more diverse than the popular image suggests. The Roman Empire had been multi-ethnic. When it collapsed, that didn't suddenly change. There were African Romans, Middle Eastern Romans. They didn't disappear. Trade continued. The Mediterranean was a highway. People moved, settled, intermarried. There were African saints, venerated in medieval Europe. Saint Maurice, for example, depicted in medieval art as a black knight. North Africans and Middle Easterners lived in medieval European cities, especially port cities, especially in Spain and Sicily, which had significant Muslim populations. The idea of a purely white medieval Europe comes from 19th century nationalism and 20th century fascism. European nations were constructing national identities. They needed a pure mythical past, so they invented one. They whitewashed medieval history. They removed the diversity that actually existed. And now people think medieval Europe was an ethno-state, which it absolutely wasn't. This lie is still being taught because it's politically useful. It supports narratives about racial purity and cultural heritage. It allows people to claim Europe has always been white and should stay that way. But it's based on deliberate falsification of history. The myth of the damsel in distress as a medieval concept is also backwards. Yes, medieval literature had women who needed rescuing. But medieval women had more power than Victorian women did. They could own property, run businesses, inherit titles. They managed estates while their husbands were at war. They negotiated treaties. Some even led armies. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful people in Europe. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England. She went on crusade. She ruled as regent. She outlived most of the men around her and died as one of the most influential political figures of her time. She wasn't unusual. She's just the most famous. Medieval widows often ran their late husbands' businesses. They were guild members, brewers, merchants, artisans. They had legal rights, not equal to men, but far more than women would have in the 19th century, when the damsel in distress became the dominant image of medieval womanhood. Victorian society was deeply restrictive for women. Women couldn't own property, couldn't vote, couldn't work in most professions. And Victorians, uncomfortable with this, projected it backward. They rewrote medieval history to make it look like women had always been helpless. This justified their own oppression. If women had always been weak, then Victorian restrictions were just natural order. But it was a lie. Medieval women were tougher than their Victorian descendants. They had to be. Life was harsh. Everyone worked. The genteel, fainting lady locked in her house was a 19th century invention, not a medieval reality. Christopher Columbus is taught as a hero who discovered America. Brave explorer, visionary. In reality, he was incompetent and brutal. He didn't discover America. Millions of people already lived there. Vikings had reached North America 500 years earlier. Columbus didn't even realize he'd found a new continent. He died thinking he'd reached Asia. He was also a terrible governor. His rule in the Caribbean was so brutal that the Spanish crown arrested him and brought him back in chains. His own contemporaries thought he was cruel. He enslaved indigenous people. He mutilated them for not bringing enough gold. He oversaw atrocities that horrified even the Spanish conquistadors, who weren't exactly known for their mercy. Columbus Day became a holiday because Italian Americans needed a hero in the late 19th century. They were discriminated against, marginalized. They wanted an Italian figure to celebrate. Columbus fit. He became a symbol of Italian contribution to American history. The myth grew from there. Now he's taught as a hero when the historical record shows he was anything but. The lie persists because it's tied to national identity. Questioning Columbus feels like questioning America. But history isn't about making us feel good. It's about what actually happened. The witch trials supposedly killed millions. That number gets thrown around constantly. But the actual number is somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people executed for witchcraft in Europe over several centuries. Mostly women. Mostly old, poor, or otherwise vulnerable. That's still horrifying. That's still monstrous. But it wasn't millions. That inflated number comes from feminist writers in the 1970s who exaggerated the death toll to make a point about patriarchal violence. The point was valid. The witch trials were an atrocity driven by misogyny and religious hysteria, but inflating the numbers undermines credibility. When people discover the real number is lower, they dismiss the entire issue. They think if the numbers were exaggerated, maybe the whole thing wasn't that bad. It's better to be accurate. 60,000 people murdered for imaginary crimes is still horrific. We don't need to inflate it. The exaggeration also obscures the real horror. The trials weren't just about numbers. They were about terror, about communities tearing themselves apart, about neighbor accusing neighbor, about torture used to extract false confessions, about elderly women being burned alive because someone's cow died unexpectedly. The psychological and social damage was immense. Focusing on inflated death counts actually minimizes that. The idea that people in the past died young also needs serious context. You hear that medieval life expectancy was 30 or 40 years and think people were ancient at 40, but that's a misunderstanding of how averages work. Life expectancy was low because infant mortality was catastrophic. If you include all the babies who died before age 5, it drags the average way down. If you survived childhood, you'd likely live into your 60s or 70s. People didn't drop dead at 30. Medieval and ancient sources are full of references to elderly people. Shakespeare was 52 when he died, which wasn't especially young. Michelangelo lived to 88. Titian painted into his 90s. These weren't bizarre anomalies. They were normal for people who survived the dangerous early years. The lie that everyone died young makes the past seem more primitive, more brutal. It supports the narrative that we've dramatically extended human lifespan through modern medicine. And modern medicine has done incredible things for infant and child mortality. But for adults who survived childhood, the extension of lifespan is less dramatic than people think. A Roman who made it to 20 might expect to live to 65 or 70, barring accidents, war, or disease. The myth of the noble savage is a lie in the opposite direction. The idea that indigenous people lived in perfect harmony with nature, never fought wars, had no social problems, existed in some kind of pre-civilized paradise. This isn't respect. This is reducing complex cultures to a fantasy. Indigenous cultures were complex. They had wars, social hierarchies, environmental impacts. They were human societies with all that entails. The Aztecs practiced human sacrifice. The Iroquois Confederacy was sophisticated, but also engaged in warfare. Polynesians hunted bird species to extinction on islands they settled. Easter Island's inhabitants deforested their entire island. Humans are humans regardless of culture, portraying indigenous people as magical. Environmentalists living in utopia before Europeans arrived is condescending. It denies their humanity. It makes them symbols instead of people. These were sophisticated societies with their own technologies, governance systems, philosophies, and yes, their own problems. They deserve to be understood as they actually were, not as props in someone else's noble savage fantasy. The Library of Alexandria burning is taught as this catastrophic loss of ancient knowledge, one fire destroying irreplaceable texts, except the library declined over centuries. There wasn't a single dramatic fire. There were multiple incidents, fires, accidents, neglect. By the time the library ceased to exist, much of its contents had been copied and distributed to other libraries across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Yes, some texts were lost. Any loss of knowledge is tragic, but the popular image of a single catastrophic fire destroying humanity's accumulated wisdom is dramatic fiction. The library's decline was gradual, boring. The myth serves a purpose, though. It creates a cautionary tale about the fragility of knowledge. It makes us value libraries and preservation. But the actual history is messier and less cinematic. Einstein failing math is one of those lies that people love because it's inspiring. Genius scientist who couldn't do basic math proves that grades don't matter, except it's completely false. Einstein was excellent at mathematics. He was at the top of his class. The myth comes from a biography that misunderstood the Swiss grading system. In Einstein's school, 6 was the highest mark and 1 was the lowest. A biographer thought it was the opposite, saw Einstein's 6s and concluded he'd failed. The error was repeated, it spread. It became common knowledge because people wanted it to be true. If Einstein failed math and still became a genius, maybe our own struggles don't matter. Maybe we're all secretly brilliant. But Einstein's genius came partly from his exceptional mathematical ability. He understood physics at the level he did, because he could handle the complex mathematics required. The inspiring lie actually undermines what made him remarkable. He wasn't a mediocre student who became great despite his limitations. He was exceptional from the start, and he worked incredibly hard. That's the actual inspiring story, but it's less comforting than the myth. Carrots improving your night vision is literal. World War II propaganda that somehow became nutritional advice. The British developed radar, technology that let their pilots intercept German bombers at night. They didn't want the Germans to know about the radar. So when British pilots started having unusual success shooting down planes in darkness, the British Air Ministry released a story. They claimed their pilots ate lots of carrots, which improved their vision at night. The Germans either bought it or couldn't prove otherwise. The story spread. It entered popular culture. And now, 80 years later, parents tell their children to eat carrots to see in the dark. It's based on military disinformation. Carrots do have vitamin A, which is important for eye health. But they don't give you night vision. They don't let you see in the dark. The entire thing was a cover story for radar technology. These lies all serve purposes. They make history simpler, more memorable. They support national myths. They make us feel superior to our ancestors. They justify current political positions. They create heroes and villains. They turn complex historical processes into simple stories with clear morals. But history isn't simple. It's not a story with a moral. It's what happened. And what happened is always more complex, more contradictory, and less satisfying than the myths we build around it. The scary part isn't that these lies exist. Every culture has myths about its past. The scary part is how resistant people are to correction. You can present evidence, cite sources, explain exactly how the lie originated, and people will still cling to it. They'll defend it. They'll attack you for challenging what they've always believed. Because admitting you believed a lie means admitting you were wrong. And being wrong is uncomfortable. It's easier to dismiss the correction than to adjust your understanding. It's easier to call the truth controversial than to accept you've been lied to. These lies weren't just mistakes. They were choices. People chose to create them, chose to spread them, chose to keep teaching them even after evidence emerged that they were false. And we keep choosing to believe them because the truth is harder. The truth requires nuance, complexity, admitting uncertainty. The lies promise clarity, simple answers. Heroes and villains, progress and decline. They promise that someone somewhere knows the truth and will tell us what it is. But nobody has all the truth. History is fragments, best guesses, narratives constructed from incomplete evidence. And the honest response isn't to create comfortable lies. It's to be as accurate as possible about what we do know while admitting what we don't. That's harder to teach. Doesn't fit on standardized tests. doesn't create satisfying narratives. But it's real, and real is what history should be.